Michael Coder. Welcome to the program entitled The American Spirit or the Spirit of America. I feel there's something special about the spirit of Americans that has been evident from the beginnings of our country. The gold rush here in California and again in World War II. This program broadcast today is about the old World War II DeWitt Center here in Auburn. What it was like to be here in 1944 to 46, when Americans like us were very concerned about war in two parts of the world and how we worked together here in Auburn to care for our wounded soldiers. To give you background on that point in time, Germany initiated the World War II on September 1st in 1939. The Japanese initiated the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7th in 1941. America began its real initiative into World War II around 1943, and at that point in time, this land around us, here at DeWitt, in front of the old church, was a grassland and a pasture. Record shows that this hospital was one of 59 sites built in the U.S. during World War II by the Surgeon General's Office of the American Army. The hospital was named for Brigadier General Calvin DeWitt, who was a soldier in the Civil War and the Spanish-American War, who served most of his officer years as a medical officer. The groundbreaking for DeWitt here was in April 7th, 1943. More than 4,000 people attended the ceremonies in this bare spot, which included a flag raising, a 27-piece military band, and a speech by Brigadier General John M. Willis, who was the commanding officer of the Army Medical Corps of the 9th Service Command stationed in Salt Lake City, who came over here special for this occasion. General Willis spoke, and he boasted about this new hospital, that DeWitt General Hospital is built along the most modern lines possible. It is the only facility of its kind. It's like a self-contained city, equipped with 1,727 beds, with its own water supply, sewage, treatment plant, boiler plant, cafeteria, recreation hall theater, church, morgue, and health club or gymnasium. It was constructed to handle the anticipated military casualties of World War II in the Pacific Theater and the European Theater. Today, I'm with Robert Haight, who worked as an Army sergeant in 1944 to 46 here at the DeWitt State Hospital. I understand he joined the Army in 42, broke his leg while on leave, saw his outfit leave him to go to England to fight in World War II. Robert was then reassigned in 44 to the newly built hospital as a supplies and property sergeant. During your 2 years here at the hospital, you must have seen many interesting things.
Yes, it was a busy place, seemingly. A lot of patients in here and a lot of staff. We had the officers, we had nurses, we had the enlisted men, we had the WACS, or Women's Air Corps, and we also had civilians working in the hospital, and we also had some German prisoners of war that assisted around the hospital.
Were you here when the groundbreaking ceremonies took place?
No, I was not. I came in the spring of 1944. Part of the hospital was still under construction. For a while we lived, the enlisted personnel lived in some of the wards, and we were later moved then into our barracks, which was still under construction when I got here.
I noticed that you brought a license plate from your stay here in 1944. How was it used? Was it a special plate, or?
This was a plate that was issued to the enlisted and officer staff, and we used this to get access in and out of the grounds, and it was attached to the front of the license plate on your car, and it let us in and out without being stopped.
Was there a guard at the gate?
Yes, there was.
So
MP.
You had to give special password or something to get
We would stop, and they'd see our plate, so then they knew we belonged here. But other than that, we didn't have to show anything.
I see. How did you get here, assigned here at DeWitt? And what do you remember about this old chapel that we're standing in front?
Well, I was assigned here after I'd broken my leg. I was sent back to Monterey for reassignment. I spent some time there, maybe 2 or 3 months, and I was reassigned here. I had clerical training. I could type. I had accounting training, And so I suppose that's why I was assigned to do the inventory work in the hospital, the property inventory. I was a property sergeant.
And your office was located on the other side of the base here.
Yeah, our office was located over there in the warehouse area. We had a fairly large office. There was civilian, I think there was about 4 civilian employees in there. I don't know how many, maybe 2 or 3 enlisted personnel, and then I think there was a couple of officers.
I noticed you brought a box with you today to show me some things. Maybe you could share some of those things in the box from 1944.
I brought along my emblem from my uniform. This is the caduceus, which is the medical symbol, and it was on our uniforms. And then I have my U.S., which was also a part of our uniform. And I brought along my dog tags. Everyone was issued a dog tag in the military. It had your name, had your serial number, and it had your blood type on it. So everyone was issued 2 dog tags.
And if you were injured?
If you were injured, they would take one of the dog tags with them so they knew. Maybe that was when you were killed. I don't recall exactly. But they would take one of the dog tags so they knew who they treated.
I notice you have your discharge card there, too.
Yes, I have my military, a pocket-sized version of my military discharge, my honorable discharge from the hospital here. And it gives our history, the person's history on the back.
And you, they issued some ribbons for
yes.
good conduct.
You got a good conduct medal, I think, every 2 years. I think there was a American
Defense.
Service. There was 3 different ribbons that I received, which is more or less standard. I did not have any overseas duty, so I did not receive any overseas. But each theater of war would have a separate type of ribbon, and these were typical of the U.S. People who served only in the U.S.
Okay, and we're standing in front of the old chapel here. Was the chapel here when you were?
Yes, the chapel was part of the activities of the hospital. The patients as well as the staff had access to the hospital, and there were services here, I believe Catholic and Protestant services. And there was a minister or a chaplain here, and there was also a chaplain's assistant who I happen to have known. He was also from Sacramento. Sacramento was my home. And he
you commuted up here.
I was able to. No, I stayed here overnight. I would commute on weekends. I had what they called a Class A pass, meaning I could go and come at any time without signing in or getting special permission. So I would go home on weekends and occasionally would bring my parents' car up with me if I wanted to go back the next night. But normally I was hitchhiking all the time. And it was very easy to do. Everybody was willing to pick you up.
The original one was the Gold Rush Community Grace Brethren Church. Around 1980, they moved in with a congregation of approximately 170 and painstakingly began to restore the church to its original condition. And one person who's actually used the church attests that the pews are still original and very hard. The Foothills Church of the Religious Science has moved in 89 and 90 and has had it ever since. We're at the Facility Services office here at DeWitt Center, and I'm standing to my right here is Alan Malberg, who's a project director. And Alan, thank you for meeting with us today and talking about the old history of DeWitt. And of course Bob Haight here is, and I've told Alan about Bob. And Alan's going to show us some of the maps and describe a little bit about what he knows. He came here, I believe, in the 70s, is that correct?
Yeah, mid-70s.
Uh-huh. And
pretty much know the history from that point, but prior to that point, it's just based on the information we picked up from newspapers and people who have been familiar with the facilities prior to that.
And can you describe the photo behind us here?
This is an aerial photograph of DeWitt Center. It's, I believe, just under 200 acres, 199.5 acres. And as I understand, it was started in April of 1943 and completed, I believe, in May of 1944. What records indicate is that the DeWitt Center was originally a hospital for the military during the war in preparation of military casualties that they were preparing for in the event that there was a need for them.
Is down here, and
well, actually, this is B Avenue, or this is Bell Road here, and the main entrance in single-digit numbers all the way up through here, 1 through I think it was 8, and then these were the buildings in the teens, building 15, 16, 17, and 18. Then this is what we would call the 100 ramp, which is the 100 series buildings. And there's the 200 series buildings that are here, and these buildings down through here are the 300 series buildings. And then there were perimeter buildings around the outside of the perimeter of DeWitt that weren't connected with the original connecting corridors that were 400 buildings.
No, so it's laid out like a checkerboard.
Well, and my understanding is we have First Street here, and this has been a modified Second Street here. This was originally Third Street that came down through here, and then the streets were A Avenue, this is B Avenue, C, D, E, and F Avenue on the outer perimeter. So they laid it out in a pretty logical format.
You said even the buildings themselves had an A and B side?
Correct. The buildings that are connected with these connecting corridors have an A and B side. The A side was on the north end and the B side was on the south end. And so these buildings, these, and all of these have A and B sides to them. You can see where these connecting corridors are.
Now, in the opening ceremonies, the general said that there was a self-contained city, that there was a sewage plant, there was water supply.
Yes.
Where are those?
The original sewer treatment plant is over here, out in this area out here. And then there was an incinerator area here where they would dispose of medical waste and that. And then over on this side was the water treatment plant. And it provided the water for the entire project. At one time this was a holding pond area for it, which is no longer being used.
Gymnasium or church?
The gymnasium is here, the theater is here, the church is here. I believe, I'm not sure, was this kind of the dining mess hall area?
Yes.
The center one, which is now the DeWitt Diner. And so a lot of these functions continue to be used in a similar format to what they were originally intended for. Others have been modified.
I wonder if we could move over to the other picture of
These are the office quarters.
the churches.
Chapel would be over here.
Chapel.
Warehouse back here. Our barracks were along in here. Those were the our barracks there.
Right, the wooden structures?
Yes.
Yes. And the wooden structures, this is a photograph that we speculate is probably around 1946 or 1948. I'm not sure if this was still under the authority of the military or if it had been transferred over to the state. It's probably military, so I'm saying 45 or 46.
This building right here was the non-coms club, and I see it's still there. It had
Right.
a basement in it, and that's non-coms had their own private club.
And as I understand, this building was an original building that was here prior to the construction of DeWitt. It was this building right here, which is currently the Veterans Service Office, as I understand it, was the first structure that is still in existence today on the property. It was built in 1929, and I believe it was originally part of the farmhouse for the DeWitt property prior to the military's utilization of this property.
First spring we were here, we had a heavy rainfall, and a lot of the buildings leaked, and it turned out, or so the conversation was, a porous brick, and they leaked. And it warped a lot of the wooden passageways, the hallways, and the
whole thing.
Oh, okay. The buildings were built of brick, and the first spring of 1944 apparently had a heavy rainfall. Anyway, the buildings leaked quite badly, and it ruined or warped a lot of the hallways running between the wards. And the solution was to whitewash the brick buildings with a non-porous whitewash, and the buildings were all white. And the scuttlebutt at the time was that the bricks that were used were a non-porous type, for a porous type brick, which caused them to leak. So apparently some contractor misused the type of brick, the wrong type of brick.
What was it like to be an enlisted man around the officers' quarters? Were there a lot of restrictions getting in and out?
Well, in those days, the officers and the enlisted personnel were not supposed to fraternize. You weren't supposed to become overly friendly with them. You weren't supposed to associate with them. I remember one time I took a young nurse to a social event in town, and I was nervous, and I suppose she was too. But anyway, we didn't get caught. But yeah, you weren't supposed to fraternize with the officers.
And then there were WACs too.
We had the Women's Army Corps, the WACs, and their barracks was adjacent to ours back there on the west side. And I don't know how many, but there was a lot of them. And they worked in the various fields in the hospital, surgery, wards, various places.
You mentioned there was kind of a humorous thing about the basement of the officers' quarters. They had machines and...
No, in the non-coms club, this private home
house.
They had a basement in there, and they had a couple of slot machines in there, which I guess they weren't supposed to have. But and of course they had their beer. Well, it was 3.2 was the percentage of beer that we were permitted to use. So I can tell you.
Are you going to ask another question?
Oh no, go ahead.
Every weekend, every Saturday, you had inspection throughout the hospital. It was a general inspection. And I happened to be heading towards the surgery area that particular day. And of course, I knew the people in there. And they had a skeleton hanging in a little closet there. And so they took the skeleton and put a nurse's cap on it with the insignia of our head nurse. I believe she was a captain. And they left that in the closet. Supposedly, then when she came along for inspection, she was going to see it. I never did hear what the outcome was, but I was there before she got there that morning, and they were showing it to me. So it was one of the humorous things that they did occasionally. And she was, I suppose, we were all in our 20s for the most part. She was probably maybe 45, and of course to us, she was an old lady. And she was a nice person, but the guys just thought they would have some little fun with her that morning.
You mentioned in the morgue area that the doctors used to go down there and work at. What was that?
They had cadavers in the mortuary. I think there was about 6 refrigerated units. They would have cadavers in there, and if they wanted to practice on something before they did the actual surgery, they would go in there and practice on a cadaver. And interestingly, after the hospital was closed, apparently they left a cadaver in there, and the Sacramento Bee had an article some months later, and when they came into the hospital to take over, they found this cadaver in the morgue down there.
There were German prisoners on the grounds assigned. I know in the research, POs assigned in 45, and also a detachment of MPs that they guarded the POWs, and they were quartered at the fairgrounds you mentioned in your letter. How did
That's
that work?
correct. There was a small detachment of MPs, POWs, prisoners of war, German prisoners of war, and they were quartered over there in the fairgrounds, and they would be transported daily to and from. And they usually came in the evening and did the yard work, the watering the lawn and the shrub and such. Then when the hospital closed down, the MPs were long gone. We still had the prisoners of war there with us in the hospital and having them go after equipment and such. And occasionally they'd forget to come back to the warehouses. They might be gone 5 or 6 hours for a job that should have taken them 2 hours, and then we'd have to go look for them, but they were hiding out. But for the most part, they were good guys. They had a few, and most of them were Austrians by nationality. There were a few of the 2 or 3 at least of the Nazi PWs, and they were more surly, but the Austrian PWs were very friendly and everything. And some of them spoke English. And again, we were not supposed to fraternize with them. We weren't supposed to talk to them other than tell them what to do.
I was talking with Alan the other day about whether maybe, I was talking to Alan the other day about the possibility that some of them may have come from North Africa, since the North African conflict was happening about that point in time.
I believe that is correct. As I recall, the uniform they wore were the uniforms that they used down there in that Africa Rommel's group. As I recall, they did have that type of uniform, yes.
Now, you mentioned the power of the newspaper, the Auburn Journal. There was an article, it turns out that it says the Army hospital patients rebelled when they found out the Germans were getting beer as part of their daily rations, and the beer was taken away from them. Do you know
I
anything
don't
about
recall that. That I didn't recall. We had another instance. One of the German POWs got acquainted with, there was a house nearby on the east side, and apparently one of the PWs made himself friendly with one of the women in the home there, so the story went. But I don't recall the beer thing.
One last question. At this location, do you remember a transportation officer at the hospital by the name of Leonard Hibbard?
No, I do
Any
not.
chance? Because he apparently was there at the same time, and he was in charge of how the ambulances brought soldiers that had been flown into McClellan Field. And there was an article in the Auburn Journal about him and his ambulances, and he said a lot of them had jungle rot, and there wasn't a lot of penicillin available at that point.
I don't recall that. However, penicillin, when we used it in the hospital, it was a grayish, no, I guess it was kind of a greenish color powder, and they would mix it with sterile water to administer it. Now when you get penicillin, it's, you know, it's all combined. So they would have to mix the sterile water and the penicillin, but I don't recall. We had a Dr. Stork, and I don't recall his military title, but he was our OB-GYN doctor, and he delivered the first baby at the hospital, and I believe it was the wife of one of the enlisted personnel. So that baby could say that a Stork brought it.
Stork, right, yeah.
Alan, one last question here from with you. You mentioned that a lot of the passageways had been destroyed.
Right. As I understand, and back in 1976 when I first started to work here, you were able to go from one end of the project to the other without going outside. You could go by the inside connecting corridors. A number of these hallways are still in existence, but a number of them have been removed also. This hallway here terminates at this point, and it's all been removed all the way to the DeWitt Diner. There's been a parking lot that's been installed. There were also some garages that have been removed, and over here these are garages that have since been removed. And if one had to go with a vehicle from one end of DeWitt to the other, we would have to literally go around the project rather than go on through, because these hallways were disrupting or interfering with the traffic flow.
That is correct. There was just the one roadway around the complex, and everything was connected by hallways,
Right.
starting from the minute you entered the front entrance all the way to all the thing that was detached was the barracks and the engineering building and the gymnasium.
Bob, here we are over by the DeWitt Cinema, which is the old movie theater, and I guess it wasn't the rec hall. You said the rec hall was more centrally located, but this was here in 44, so there must have been some USO kind of activities here and
I
things.
don't recall the theater. Why, I don't know. I guess I didn't go there that often. The rec hall was where they had the USO shows, and it was a much bigger, 3 or 4 times
Really?
the size of this theater building.
Well, this hallway, as you look down, you can see how it extends through all the different, I call them barracks, but you call them...
Central hallway, they'd be wards either side, and then it would go clear down there, and then be the central hallway that went from the front to the back of the place.
Right, and so this, as we're going to walk down here toward the theater, over here by this fire used to be a doorway that's now been sealed, and so we'll go around and go in the main entrance. Okay, Bob, this is the old DeWitt Theater, and this used to be the ticket office, and in fact, this was used when the county was here, when it was the Auburn Cinema. We've now are more informal and have tickets inside, and so you're welcome to come on in the lobby.
All right.
And this lobby is all brick, and one of the things we noticed here was, like you said, the brick was very porous. When I tried to put screws and things into the brick, it just goes in like butter, so I can see this has been a problem. This is Connie Burke, who used to be the one that ran the theater. We took over from her. She's a well-known lady who grew up in the 50s in this area, and actually as a kid came to the Auburn Cinema, and then she ran the cinema, Auburn, as a movie theater for a number of years, and then we took it over from Connie. She passed away here in the last 2 years. We have shows. The Auburn Youth Symphony performs here and practices here. We have the Auburn Gold Country Children's Chorus, and there's a number of shows that have been here. In fact, right now we're doing Thumbelina, which is a original musical based on a fairy tale. So we'll go inside and take a look at the stage area, see if you recognize anything. And often straight ahead of you here, Bob, is the other side of that hallway.
Main entrance there.
Main entrance. This is where the patients came down, the soldiers, and then they would wheel into the theater over through here. So as we go through the theater, you can see the sound changes dramatically because it's real open, real live, and the bricks are exposed on the walls. When we moved in, they weren't. They, as a cinema, movie theater, you like to have soft fabric on the walls, and but we took it off because we wanted to get back to the original look. And the seats, this is the second generation of seats. I think these were put in the 50s or 60s. But we do find in our back rooms some of the original seats that didn't have the padding. They were made of wood, and they were part of the original theater. And on the back wall here, you can see some of the events that we've done over the past 2 or 3 years. The stage had a movie screen as well. And I can show you when we get up on the stage here how the screen used to roll down. The stage is 3 feet high and is all wooden, of course, and you can tell that the structure underneath of it was built back in the 40s. It's very solid. The rafters up in the attic are made of wood that's really, you can't find anything like it in the lumber yard nowadays. And up above us, there's a screen that rolls down almost 30 feet wide, and it drops all the way down to the floor here, and you can have you can maybe get a shot of it from over on this side, and it's what the soldiers used when they watched films here. The capacity was about 250. I looked in an old newspaper here, and it said that U.S. shows were shown held here. Visitors were celebrity visitors were common occurrences. In fact, the boxer Max Baer was a patient here at the hospital, as well as author William Sororin, Rhonda Fleming, Lon Chaney Jr., Eddie Cantor was here, Dorothy Lamour, Robert Alda, and Joey Brown all made their way to Auburn to cheer up the recuperating soldiers. And the DeWitt Cinema, the gym, the pool, the buildings now housing the Placer County Sheriff's Department, and the church are all that's left over from the military installation that closed in December the 31st, 1945. And so I guess the recreation hall disappeared too, but there was some very notable movie stars.
Yes, I don't recall any particular movie star or anyone, but we did have, the USU people brought a lot of people in at different times, and they were usually notable people.
I was wondering why Max Baer, the boxer Max Baer, was a patient here.
I don't recall that. That's interesting. I don't recall him being a patient here. But they probably didn't publicize it. Everyone had been wanting to go up there and get his autograph, so they probably didn't publicize it.
Okay, you mentioned in your letter that the first patients arrived in the spring of '44. Where did they come from, and how did this work with the helping with civilians in the area?
Well, there was an SP train derailment a little east of Auburn, and it was early in the morning, maybe 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and the people, the doctors and the ambulances were sent from here. An interesting thing, they came through the barracks and awakened us to see if we were authorized to drive an ambulance, and none of us were, and that kind of aggravated them. So they managed to get enough people to drive the ambulance to go after them. But shortly after that, we all had to learn how to drive an ambulance.
Well, you mentioned also that there was something to do with a forest fire in a plane.
Yes, there was a fire one time, forest fire, and we were called out to help fight it. The ward boys and such were not, because they worked 12-hour shifts, and the clerical staff and such did not. They worked maybe an 8-hour shift. So we were always called to do extra duty. Another time, there was an indication that a plane had gone down, probably out in the Forest Hill area, and this was at night, and they got a lot of us into ambulances and were out looking for this so-called plane down. As it turned out, we never did find a plane, so they figured it was probably a falling star that someone had seen. Another time we had a plane crash, a military plane. Everything was blackout, of course, in those days, and they thought they were over McClellan Field. They wanted to land at McClellan Field, and somehow they got confused, and they crashed into one of the foothills out here. And of course, there were casualties in that, and they brought them into our hospital and into the morgue.
Mm-hmm. What was a typical day like for you as an enlisted man here? I mean, what time did you get up? Were there speeches by the colonel, or how did it work?
Well, my recollection is there was throughout the system there was a PA system, and I think they had a call or something to get us up, and I forgot what time. We probably got up around 6 or 6:30. We had meals in the mess hall, and it was probably around 7. Then we could return to our barracks, and then we report to duty. I think we reported to duty at 7:30, 8 a.m., and we spent a whole day there, and I think we were finished around 4:30 or 5 o'clock, and then we could go for our dinner, and then we were free to do whatever we wanted the rest of the day.
Now, you didn't go home to Sacramento?
No, I would go home on weekends. We finished our day on Saturday afternoon, and I was free for the weekend, so I would go home to my home in Sacramento, hitchhiking, of course, and spend the weekend at my parents' place, and then hitchhike back Sunday night. And that was always interesting. Sometimes you get a ride in a truck, sometimes you get a ride in an old broken down car or whatever. But it was interesting. They were always willing to pick up the GIs and give us a ride.
Now, if you were a World War II prisoner at that during the day, what was their day like? How did they started over at the fairgrounds, and then
the POWs that were here, the German POWs were here. They lived over in the fairgrounds on the other side of Auburn. They were transported each day to the hospital to do their work. As I recall, they were here mostly in the evening, and they did the yard work, mowing the lawn, watering the plants and such.
And they were transported by the MPs.
Yes, they were transported by the MPs.
Who you said disappeared actually at the end.
After they closed the hospital down, the MPs were long gone, and the POWs were still here, and we worked for them. But there was no danger. They were not a threat to us, and they were regular people. Some of them could speak English, and they were okay to get away. There was a few surly ones. There was a few Nazi types in there, and they were a little more surly. But the others were Austrians, and they were much friendlier. And so we didn't have any problem disciplining them or anything.
Now, you weren't discharged from this location. I read in one of the historical documents that soldiers who were patients at DeWitt who were discharged received $100 and traveling money and at 5 cents a mile and a little pin showing that they were discharged from the service.
Yes, when you were discharged, you were giving money for transportation to your home. And in my case, I was discharged. I was sent from here to Camp Beale, which was discharge center, and then transported. They weren't transported. I rode a bus home. But they paid you for the mileage to your home.
And I guess I know when I got out of the Marine Corps, my last 30 days they put me on mess duty. And did you catch anything like that?
I never had mess duty as such, but anytime they had the Inspector General come through the hospital, and maybe that would be 3 or 4 times during that 2-year period that we were operating, they'd want to clean up the kitchen. And they'd always call on us to go down and clean up the kitchen. The kitchen staff was not enough of them, so we'd be down there scrubbing things here, there, and everywhere to make the place clean for the Inspector General. But it was always the clerical people that got called in on things like that. They couldn't call the ward boys in because they were 12-hour shifts and they were sleeping or whatever. So we got called in on doing various things like that at various times.
How about guard duty? I know even as an electronic technician, as I was, I still had to do guard duty. Did you have
I
to
got assigned to guard duty once. We had a German PW in here who was burned very severely. And I knew he was burned severely. I knew I knew a little bit about him. He had been in the hospital for a few days. And there was not enough MPs here to guard on a 24-hour basis. So again, they called some of the clerical people in to guard him. And I got a shift about 2 o'clock in the morning. And I was not familiar with guns or anything. And so one of the traditions was that you would take your clip out of your gun and show the person that you were leaving that the clip contained all the bullets. If the bullets were not all there, as I recall, you were charged $1 for every bullet that was missing. Why that, I don't know. But anyway, I got called, so when the person I was relieving gave me the gun to check the clip, I let him check the clip because I was not familiar with it. I didn't want to blow my head off or the German PW's head off. So I sat there in the night in the, it was a linen closet. I sat in there and his room was across from me. And I left the gun in the holster on the, pardon me, in the linen closet. I wasn't going to touch it. Excuse me. When I got relieved, I let my relief check the gun to see that the clip contained all the bullets. But we got called on various things, from doing MP duty to cleaning the kitchen whenever they had something extra that they wanted help on.
I know that during that period of time there was a lot of patriotism going around, it felt in our country by people that we had wars. Pearl Harbor had just happened earlier, then we had the push for Normandy and the invasion, and the hospital was built. There was a lot of enthusiastic support of that. It was one of 59 hospitals in the States. People were really behind our country. How did you, any feelings that you can recall about how your Army buddies felt about the Germans or the Japanese or our country or patriotism?
I don't think we ever
feel, you know, what were they thinking back in '44?
I don't recall having any bad feelings or ill feelings against the Japanese or the Italians or the Germans, which is part of the war effort. We didn't discuss it that I recall. We would get training films once in a while showing things that they were doing, and but I don't recall having any ill feeling against them. Of course, they were our enemy, and I guess we respected them as such.
Well, you saw a lot of the product of the war coming in here in wards, people with all sorts of terrible injuries. How did that make you feel?
Well, of course, you had to feel for them. They were injured, you weren't, and they were a long way from home. In my case, Sacramento was my home, but it was pretty rough seeing some of them. I recall one case. We had Alaska was invaded during World War II by the Japanese, and it was bayonet fighting. And I recall we had some patients in that area, and this one young fellow had been stabbed in the back, and he was paralyzed. And I can remember going in the ward, and he was just laying there weeping because of the pain. They could not get rid of the pain for him. But a lot of people did not know that the Japanese did invade of Alaska, a part of the Alaskan area, and it was a hand-to-hand combat with the bayonets. So walking through the wards and such, you'd see people in all different conditions, and it was not easy to look at some of them, that's for sure.
Now, you told me once that there was 3 functions of the hospital. What were those?
Yes, primarily we were a mental hospital taking care of mental patients. We were a burn center treating burn patients, and we were, I guess you'd call it a reconstructive center, or maybe like plastic surgery, and we did that type of work. We had a young fellow in there that was very capable and very talented in doing that type of work. I recall one case, a young man had a indentation in his scalp. He apparently had a portion of his scalp blown away or something, and they had done a preliminary surgery and closed the skin over the exposed area. And this friend of mine, who was the one that did this reconstructive work, he fashioned a piece of metal to fit over that plate, and eventually they put the patient back in the hospital, put this plate over his head, and then put the skin back over it. And when it was all finished, you couldn't tell that it had an indentation other than the scars there. But he used to walk around the hospital. He was feeling okay, and he was just waiting for this plate to be made. And this young fellow he was a technician, I believe he was a technical sergeant. He was very talented along that line. That's the only case of that type that I remember. It was so visible, and they had taken pictures before and after, and I saw it, but I also saw the patient walking around before and after. So we did some real good types of work here.
Was the morale pretty high among the patients, or did it vary by their injuries?
I could not tell you. I did not associate that much with the patients as far as talking with them. I didn't.
They probably really looked forward to the USO shows.
I'm sure they did, yes. It was a type of entertainment. And we had a post-exchange, PX as we called it, and they were free to go in there, those that were ambulatory. And of course they had their own mess hall, and they could those that were ambulatory could move around on their own will.
Well, now after all these years, Robert, how does it feel coming back to all these old buildings? And I know when we walked through the hallway there, you mentioned something to me.
Well, the buildings when I was here were all interconnected with passageways and everything, hallways. And now, of course, the hallways are all gone. And we stood outside the theater here and looked down the passageway. It just kind of seemed eerie to be looking down that passageway there. It wasn't that way to me when I was here, but I just kind of got that eerie feeling now.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is the second time you've driven down here. You must be, this must have an attraction for you.
I came here last spring. I had met a young lady from the hospital, from one of the buildings here, at the 2000 California State Fair, and she was at the Placer County booth, and I just happened to be talking to her, and I mentioned this being a hospital. She didn't know it had ever been a hospital. And I said, well, I've been wanting to come up for a long time. And so she gave me her name and told me which office she worked in. And so I got one of my daughters to come up with me last spring, and we went to look for the lady, and it was her day off. And I took my little license plate to show her and the others. And there was an older lady in there that had recollection of it had been a hospital. But this young lady had no idea that it had been a hospital here.
Well, DeWitt has done marvelous things for a lot of people for a lot of years, and still does. It's amazing with the women's shelter and senior center and all the activities that the county has here. And I just really want to thank you for the time you've taken to come from Antelope and spend with us this few... Well,
it's been my pleasure, Mike. I really enjoyed getting up here. It kind of refreshed my own mind and the way things are situated here, although they look different because they're all disconnected now. And when I was here, everything was connected. So it looks different. But I enjoyed coming up here, and it's been my privilege to talk with you.
Well, thank you very much.
All right, Mike.